told the story about the beheading of John the Baptist by King Herod. Now this King Herod was the son of Herod the king who killed the children in Bethlehem 30 years earlier in that effort to try to eliminate Jesus as a child. So I guess brutality was still a hallmark of the Herod family, even in this second generation. Matthew included the story in his gospel, but Luke and John don't even mention it, and I can understand why. The beheading of John the Baptist is a gruesome act. And it's something that we still see in the Middle East, where some terrorists still do it. And then they post pictures about it on the internet. It's gruesome. It's X-rated videos, the beheading of one's enemies. The callous, almost frivolous reason given as to why King Herod executed John the Baptist, a promise that he made to his stepdaughter during the king's birthday party, adds to our revulsion. And how simple and sad was the very next sentence. His disciples came and took the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. It was Mark's gospel also that first told about Jesus feeding the 5,000 men, plus women and children, from those 5 loaves and 2 fish that the disciples had on hand. Apparently, this miracle was more memorable than the beheading. This event was not only picked up by Matthew and by Luke when they wrote their gospels, it was even picked up by the Gospel of John 2 or 3 generations later. It's the only miracle that Jesus did that is reported in all 4 of our gospels. Now, I'm going to have us look at both of these stories side by side this morning. First, the death of John the Baptist, and then the feeding of the 5,000. I preached a sermon about the beheading of John the Baptist way back on July 3rd of 2016. So some of you may remember it because I told the story in the first person from the perspective of Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who was King Herod's chief steward. He was responsible for the silver platter on which the Baptist's head was then presented. Yuck. But the good news that came out of that horrible story was that Chuza's wife, Joanna, became a follower of Jesus. She is named in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 8, right alongside Mary Magdalene and the other female disciples who followed Jesus and provided for them from their own means. Joanna, Susanna, Mary Magdalene served Jesus. Now, looking back in my sermon files, I also realized I first wrote about the beheading of John the Baptist all the way back in March of 1984 in a Lenten devotional that we published in Zurich, Switzerland, where I was serving as an interim minister at the International Protestant Church. That was 36 years ago. So only 2 times in my career have I focused on the death of John the Baptist. So I guess I tend to avoid bad news of public brutality and talking about it as much as did Luke and John in their day. It's not a happy topic to deal with. Regarding the miracle of Jesus' multiplication of fishes and loaves to feed the 5,000, I first preached about that one in August of 1988 at Bay Shore Church in Patty's hometown of Long Beach, California, where I was the associate minister. That was 31 years ago. And then again, 16 years later, in March of 2004, I preached about it in Torrance when I was the minister of the Seaside Community Church. And I preached on it yet a 3rd time, 7 years later, in 2011 at the Los Altos UCC in Long Beach. Feeding so many with so little was a challenge each of those 3 churches were struggling with. And so I thought preaching about that miracle of unexpected abundance, that miracle of sharing what one has with others within the community, that miracle of trusting God to be a generous provider, it needed to be said to them. They were wrestling with that. In effect, I was saying, trust God, have faith, we can do this. As for here in Alpena, in 6.5 years, I have never preached on this Bible story here at First Church. Even though this feeding of the 5,000 story is the only miracle that is included in all 4 of our Gospels, I've never preached about it here. And I'm not going to today either. That's because I don't think this congregation has that problem. However, I have discussed it at length in the Monday morning Bible study, twice, and in the Tuesday afternoon Bible study, first at Barb and Glenn Kett's house, and more recently at Jim and Patty McNeil's home. What I am going to do, however, is to have you notice the linkage between those 2 stories. We talk about King Herod's execution of John the Baptist, and we talk about the feeding of the 5,000. I have shelves of commentaries on one or the other of those passages. Books of sermons by other ministers preaching on one or the other of those stories, because they're always treated as separate events. And that's how the lectionary works. Selections of Scripture are packaged in a prearranged bundle for Lutherans and Roman Catholics, for Methodists and Presbyterians, for Episcopalians and those other more liturgical churches, and they use it according to a 3-year rotation calendar. Sunday school curricula is also produced in tandem with the assigned readings, but the link between the stories is often neglected. So here's how I see it. The butchering of John the Baptist as a public spectacle at King Herod's birthday party would have been gruesome to witness. It would have been a public act of terrorism at the highest level of government, letting the disciples and followers of John know that they were outside the law, that perhaps they would be subject to the same fate. It's a terror tactic. Was then, still is now. And yet Matthew tells us that his disciples, they didn't retaliate. They didn't storm the palace. His disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now this was a bold thing to do. To come forward in public and provide for the burial of your recently executed leader, removing a beheaded corpse from inside of King Herod's prison, that took courage. And then they went and told Jesus the news. As you know, Jesus had been baptized by John. Jesus was a significant part of the Baptist movement from the very beginning. John's disciples bring word to Jesus that the Baptist had been beheaded and his body had been buried. Matthew tells us now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place, apart. Jesus wants to mourn in private. Jesus needs to grieve. Jesus goes on a retreat, in effect, to find solitude. And I suppose he needed to process the news that had rocked his world. There's an old hymn that says, "I love in solitude to shed the penitential tear, and all God's promises to plead when none but God is near." And I get that. I mean, I so get that. Getting away, getting out of town, right? Being alone, being out there in solitude with nobody but God beside you. I think Jesus had feelings just like you and I do. He was human after all. Yes, he expressed the fullness of divinity, but in a fully human way. Jesus needed to mourn in private. Jesus wanted to grieve. And he wanted to talk with God about what's going on. And where's the future now for his movement? But when the crowds heard it, Matthew goes on to say, they followed him on foot from the towns. And as he went ashore, he saw a great throng, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And I tell you, I feel for Jesus. He wants the time and space to grieve the death of his faithful friend. He wants the time and the space to process his anger at this brutal beheading. Jesus needs to make sense of the senseless. He needs to buck up his courage to face these new terrors. He has to find a way to carry on the legacy of ministry that John the Baptist and he had begun. But the crowd won't give him the time or the space. Even though Jesus has taken a boat out onto the lake and has come to shore in a lonely place apart, the crowd comes by foot following him. Jesus was confronted by a great throng and he healed their sick. I can tell you that Jesus Christ was much more patient, much more compassionate, more of a caregiver and healer than I would have been. John the Baptist had been beheaded. This is a crisis moment. Jesus had been told the news and he was in grief, and yet he has compassion on people who are needier than himself. He heals them well into the evening. Jesus' disciples come to him and they say, in effect, "We've had enough. It's late. It's been a long day. These people are needy." Here's how Matthew puts it. The disciples came to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away. Go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Makes sense, right? They got here on their own. They can move along now, right? There's markets in the villages. Maybe there's a restaurant or two. They've been helped. They've been healed. Now they should get on with their lives and get out of our hair, right? Don't they know Jesus has bigger fish to fry than what he's doing with them? There's got to be at least 5,000 of them or more. This is a lonely place, Jesus. And the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go to